You're listening to We Need to Talk About Bryce, Courageous Conversations with Bobby Henry and Guests, a podcast where we engage in courageous conversations using Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce's 1922 pamphlet, The Story of a National Crime, as provocation. I'm Bobby Henry, and I am the host of this podcast. I am a community member of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory community. I am an assistant professor at Brock University and a PhD student in the Indigenous Studies PhD program at Trent University. For those unfamiliar with Dr. Peter H. Bryce, he was Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1904 to 1921. During this time, he examined health conditions in residential schools and wrote yearly reports calling for changes to the way Indigenous children were treated. His reports were ignored. After retirement in 1921, Dr. Bryce felt compelled to speak more broadly and publicly on the issue, and in 1922 he self-published The Story of a National Crime, in which he directly petitioned King George V in Canadian Parliament to act on the matter of the health of Indigenous children and the conditions in residential schools. In 2022, as we record these episodes, it has been 100 years since the publication of this report. In this time, a lot has happened, a lot has changed, and a lot has stayed the same. This podcast is part of Defining Moments Canada's Bryce at 100 project, which aims to create educational resources to help educators bring this ongoing defining moment of engaging in truth and reconciliation, truth before reconciliation, into their classrooms. In each episode, we will listen to excerpts from the original report as recorded by Miles Morrisseau. Guests will react to what we have heard, and then I will lead an open conversation circle to discuss the context, implications, and contemporary realities connected to Bryce's report. In our fifth and final episode, my guests and I will continue our conversation on Dr. Peter H. Bryce's health research, with an emphasis on futurity and hope for the next 100 years. I have two guests joining me in today's courageous conversation. My first guest is Gabrielle Fayant-Lewis. Gabby originates from Fishing Lake Metis Settlement, Alberta. She is an award-winning woman for her work in community, her dedication to supporting young people, and amplifying grassroots efforts. Gabby is passionate about cultural resurgence, revitalization, and restitution for all Indigenous peoples. She has worked with several Indigenous and non-profit organizations. My second guest is Teresa Edwards. Teresa is a member of Listuguj Mi'kmaq First Nation in Quebec. Her ceremonial name is Young Firewoman, a name that she strives to fulfill through her work as an international human rights lawyer. Teresa is the executive director and in-house legal counsel for the Legacy of Hope Foundation, which she has held since 2017. For over 30 years, she has been a strong advocate for Indigenous peoples by championing changes in programs, policy, and legislation from within government, and while working with national Indigenous organizations such as the Assembly of First Nations, Native Women's Association of Canada, and from within her own legal practice. She works to bring equity to Indigenous peoples by improving socioeconomic conditions and their overall well-being. The quotes we will be listening to today are found on page 18 from the Story of a National Crime pamphlet. You can access the Story of a National Crime on Defining Moments Canada's website via the link in the show's notes.
In view, therefore, of all the facts herein recited, I make my appeal for simple justice, that I be permitted to carry on my work as Chief Medical Officer of Indian Affairs, and I believe that I have the right to demand, after a thorough investigation of all the facts of the case, that the chief obstacle as set forth in the story to ensuring the health and prosperity of the 100,000 Indians, the wards of the nation, be removed. Since the time of Edward I, the people have ever exercised their historic right to lay their petitions before the King and Parliament. I now desire herein respectfully to bring my appeal for the Indians of Canada before the King's representative and the Parliament of Canada, feeling sure that justice will be done both to them and to myself. Peter Henderson Bryce.
So we just listened to the recording by Miles reading us that last couple paragraphs or couple lines for the Story of a National Crime pamphlet. And as always, when I start these conversations, I want us to hear those words and for us to think about them and think into what it is we're reacting to. And so for this case, I just want to open the floor to you, Gabby, to share with us what stuck out to you in Miles's recording.
I have like a lot of thoughts about it, just about the whole thing in general, but I think some initial thoughts is like even though Dr. Peter Bryce was very vocal about the inequities and like all of the horrific things he was finding, he actually wasn't that vocal about residential schools themselves and the fact that they were assimilating Indigenous children and people. He was just these schools are fine, but they just have to make sure that you're treating people healthy at the schools, but didn't actually take in wasn't really critical about the whole process and policy itself. So those are some things I think about. And I work with a lot of Indigenous youth that are so critical about capitalism and colonization and all these things that have such a strong hold over us. And a lot of the youth, they don't really see reform as the way forward. They really want to dismantle these systems of oppression. And that's the one critique I would have of Dr. Peter Bryce, is that he very much still wanted to operate within the system, but he was more on the side of reform. But for myself and a lot of the youth that I work with, reform hasn't really gotten us very far. It's 100 years later, right? And so those are some of my critiques. I think also the other thing that comes to mind is we're constantly having to prove that we're worthy of a healthy future and a healthy living and basic needs. Whether it was Dr. Peter Bryce or other non-Indigenous peoples trying to bring that to light. It's still the same. It's still the same 100 years later. We'll find so many reports that say the exact same things, all these conditions that Indigenous youth and children are experiencing, but it still goes unheard. And so yeah, you tend to lose a lot of faith in these structures. And we deserve so much more than having to beg for basic needs. And so that leads me into thinking okay, what do we do next? How do we move forward? But yeah, so those are some initial thoughts though.
No, thank you for sharing those. And interestingly, this is a conversation I've had with many people outside of talking with people for the podcast. That same idea too of his position, his thoughts on the matter. And I think we even talked about this in a previous episode on the theme of education. And that same idea, you're talking to his position, his outlook then was contrary to what he was trying to propose. It's he's arguing these schools are fine should they have good health care. He wasn't speaking to the fact that these schools were assimilating children. And I think a lot of my work, and even myself having some background in history, I'm always cognizant of presentism, right? Because we look back in time and to see from our today values to make an understanding of what had happened before us. And not to say that that's wrong, but it's to remind us that, we have to factor in that. But I still wonder that same question. And this is why I wanted us to have this conversation, to start us thinking about this report, because that last line, feeling sure that justice will be done for them and to myself. To me, it's is that an omission, or not omission, is that an admission to the fact that maybe in his time as a chief medical officer, he was writing his reports, but, it was only from a perspective of health. Looking back on this, it's kind of I'm not sure exactly what he's speaking to, because he includes himself deliberately, right? And maybe it's that fact. I just want to know, what are your thoughts on that piece there? Because that closing line gets me thinking. It's important for us to interrogate these historical figures. I like that idea. But there's something there when he says himself in the quote.
Yeah, and I think it's something that a lot of people do today as well. Like when you think of reconciliation, a lot of people that consider themselves allies usually don't do things under the guise of reconciliation unless they can get something out of it. So I assume it's like a similar type of vibe where, like, we like to call it white saviorism. That's like, I guess, like the common term I like to use, and it ties into white supremacy and how, it was very, very prominent in those days. Like, even the creation of the Indian Act, for example, like the white supremacy in that piece of legislation is just right in your face. And I like this white saviorism type of rhetoric. I see it as well in that reading. And people don't do it unless there's something in it for them. And I think that's why there's so many calls to action that have gone unimplemented, because Canadians like have a hard time moving forward without seeing what's in it for themselves. Even when you look at residential schools, there was something for Canadians in the creation of residential schools. And I don't think we talk about that enough, how the removal of Indigenous children from their homelands and the breakdown of these families really benefited Canadians. It gave up land that Indigenous peoples were using. It gave up understandings that we had that tied us to the land. And we're slowly like getting what was stolen from us back, but it's not quick enough. And I don't think Canadians see why they should act on something unless they can get something in return. Like that ties into like the whole reason why capitalism is like running this society, how colonialism acts. It all ties into those individual like understandings of things, and then that creates a collective of folks that are really not willing to act in a just way.
And just listening to your words, it brings back memories when like the Kamloops incident happened, where the graves are uncovered. Right, you saw a lot of social media pick it up. You've seen a lot of news coverage of it, and it's like that trend we have in society. We jump on board, we bandwagon certain things that are, very hip at the time. And so for me, what you're saying, it makes sense, right? Because that pattern has not stopped. Even in your work, right? And this is even what I draw attention to for people as well, to always be mindful. Like there's a gifting of things. There's no exchange. And I think a lot of how we function, maybe as an economy, maybe as a group of people, is more tied to like an exchange economy, right? What I mean by that, and this is what I do in my own work, right? What I do with university students and those that I mentor in my position at Brock, I say I was gifted knowledge from teachers before me. It is my duty, and this is what my father even said to me countless times, your job's to share the knowledge with people. But there's a caveat to what you share, and that is you don't expect anything in return, right? I take to heart what he said, right? That this work and the way how we do things is for others. We gift it with the expectation that that gift will just keep going through society in a circular format. Eventually it might come back to you in some shape or form, or maybe it doesn't. That's part of life, right? So it's interesting you say that, and I was just kind of jogged my memory of things that I do. And you talk a lot about youth in your work. This work that we're doing with Defining Moments is about creating a resource for teachers who will be working with youth, right, in K through 12 schools, maybe early years. I'm not sure if it's tailored towards early years, but it might be educational for those working in preschools. I guess the question for you is, why would this matter to youth of all sorts, and why is it important for youth to know this, right? And you can bring in your experiences and what your stories,
That's a really good question. Like as you were talking though, this isn't gonna answer that question, but I was just thinking about I find it really kind of like I have like really dark humor. So I think it's funny, but it's also not that funny. But we have a little store in the Byward Market in Ottawa, and so around Orange Shirt Day on September 30th, we had this like huge influx of people that really wanted orange shirts. Like I call them orange shirt zombies. Because they just like they didn't want nothing but orange shirts. And they were so upset. Like they would come into our store, a store that's Indigenous run, supports Indigenous businesses, employs Indigenous youth. They would come into the store and they wouldn't see an orange shirt, and then they just like leave. The intentions and like again like that white saviorism, like and like doing performative allyship, we're still stuck in that. We're still stuck in like Canadians that want to show that they did something good. They want to wear it, and then they want to go home and not think about it again. So yeah, that's like some of the experiences we're seeing right now. And I think why this work is so important and talking about it openly is so important is that so youth are able to get ahead of these types of I don't know, like societal trends, that they're able to get ahead of them, because whatever you've seen in the past, it can happen again so quickly. Like without that education, without that deeper understanding of why these policies, why this type of genocide even happened in the first place, it can happen again so quickly. And not only are Indigenous communities and peoples at risk of having these horrific things happen to us again, it's a threat to all living beings, in my opinion. Even recently, we're seeing the rise of neo-Nazis, and that's something that I think a lot of Canadians thought was just in the past, but because we've just let things slide and because we haven't been really critical about these white supremacist views, these really sexist views, and we've just let things slide, I think we're seeing that rise of it again. And to me, that's really scary as well. And we see all kinds of policies that are just continuations of residential schools, like child welfare is the biggest one right now. To me, it really is just a continuation of residential schools. This impacts the whole society. It's not just it just impacts one community, but has an impact on everyone. And the traumas that people either experienced or contributed to will live in their bloodlines for generations. And like I think about like white guilt, for example, and how that's like intergenerational, how that's like trickled down to today's generations. And how we're seeing like a lot of young people that are becoming very violent and becoming very just alone and isolated, and the mental health of people right now is so poor. And so if we're able to talk about things and address things and have informed decision making, I really believe that that's how we fight back against like this loneliness and despair we're seeing a lot of people experience today.
Just speaking to what you shared always reminds me of the phrase that can get it's a contentious term, and you'll know this term very well. It's used many times when we talk about the history of oppression, assimilation, and genocide in Canada to just get over it, right? And I find that to be, well, we all know why it's problematic, because it's something that's historical, something in the past. The argument always is, well, my grandparents that wasn't during their time. Wasn't directly involved in residential schools, but I think there's a point of that can really move you very far, right? It's an excuse to admit. First point, and then the second point, I always tell this to my students: treaties were used to acquire large parcels of land, depending on the era of treaties. And I remember in a talk with John Malloy, who was a researcher at Trent. He talked about how residential schools in the West were used as a mechanism to reward good behavior of parents. And that was striking when I heard it, because again, that's where residential schools, and a lot of my work and what I see is residential schools is taught in isolation away from the larger mechanism of oppression. And I say to students and people who I work with, it's the tool that's the aggressive nature, that it's the culmination of many systems coming together. And when you hear an expert in residential schools talk about it in that way, it just is striking, right? And so for going back to my point earlier, getting over it, it's like we know the history as Indigenous people, right? But the large body is still very much learning. And so what is really happening here, when that term is being used? And the trauma and the pain is still in our communities, and youth today are feeling the effects of it, right? And so I think there's something there for us to move forward, and the youth is the way forward, right? And I know your organization works a lot with youth, right? And so I would welcome you to speak a little bit to what you do in your organization and your role, and also shed a little light on the projects of what you're doing, and just to kind of share what you see youth are doing. And I would love to meet these youth you're talking to, because when you're saying that they're challenging capitalism, pushing back against neoliberalism and hegemony and hegemonic narratives, like these youth sound amazing, and I want to meet them.
Yeah, they are awesome. Yeah, and I guess like before I talk a little bit about A7G, one thing that I think is really important to point out is that, Indigenous youth are targeted and severely overrepresented in all forms of institutionalization. And the reason why this is really important for Canadians to realize and understand is that, like, Canadians are paying their taxes to pay for this institutionalization of Indigenous children and youth. Like, it's literally costing Canadians money. And there's a lot of money going into it, like Indigenous, like all the Indigenous services and CERNAC. They're some of the biggest departments of the Canadian government. And this should be really alarming to Canadians. But again, like, I think it's that lack of education, where people just don't even realize this. But yeah, there's millions and billions of dollars going into, keeping our youth incarcerated and in child welfare, and yeah, and scrutinized and watched. And their needs, like, mental health services and, community engagement and clean running water and proper housing conditions are where there's no money. And so it's really, really unfair. But on the flip side, to talk a little bit about A7G, so we're super grassroots. We've been doing this since like, I Don't Know More. I Don't Know More was like a huge, I think, spark for myself and the folks that were youth at the time. And we carried on that work. And it really was, we didn't really know what we wanted to do, like, or how to do it, I guess. But we knew that Indigenous youth needed a platform. They needed their voices to be amplified. We needed spaces where we could organize. We needed programs and activities that we decided, not programs and activities that someone else has decided for us, in a big government building somewhere they've never even been to our communities. And so we just started mobilizing. We started doing like a few events here and there. One of the events was an elders and youth gathering, for example, because a lot of the youth at the time said that they wanted to, reclaim that culture that was stolen from them, that those languages, just those basic understandings of what even community is. And so we did that for a few years, but then, things were things got really hard, especially when there was like a Housing First initiative that was created in the federal government. And again, people that have never experienced homelessness or housing inequities deciding what a housing what a housing strategy should look like. It's just, replicating all these things that we're talking about, right? Even from Dr. Peter Bryce's time. And they ended up shutting down a housing drop-in. And so this had a huge impact on our local community. There were several people that passed away, literally died because of this policy change. And, there's like a huge amount of survivor's guilt that happens for those of us that are still alive and surviving these type of policies and attempts. But we kept mobilizing, we kept gathering, and we learned about this group in Winnipeg that just met every Friday. And we're like, what? Like, how do you do that? And they're like, we just do it. And that was like totally like pulling like the wool off of our faces, off of our eyes. Like, we're like, what do you mean you can just do something? And I think that's like a part of like the nonprofit industrial complex is like we begin to think that we need some type of funding in order to do something. And yeah, funding would be great. But, if you're able to mobilize and you can do something and create community, out of the goodness of your own heart, like that's so powerful. And so we've been gathering every Friday for the last, I think we're on year 5 coming up this March. And we've never missed a Friday night. We've gathered during the pandemic, not in person, but even online. We still kept it going. And we've gathered through like tornadoes and like natural disasters and like all kind of things. And it gets really heavy at times, just kind of like having to carry that weight of the community. But it's so needed. And we always say like, we'll stop gathering when no one shows up. And like there'll be like a night where there's like one person and you're like, well, I guess this is the night. But then like half an hour later, like it's just full of people and they're like, oh, we're a little late tonight. So yeah, we're still going. And from that like gathering from that Friday night, it's kind of like a council, I guess you could call it. But it's like this space where people gather, they socialize, they eat together, and then new ideas come from there. And so that's where like the other programs that we've done really come from. So at one Friday night, for example, there was a youth that was like, I want to teach my papa's language. I want to teach Ojibwe. We're like, cool, like let's try it out. There's enough people here that we could support you to do that. And yeah, we just keep growing from there. We have this really cool report on our website. It's just kind of like a report that we did with one of our funders. And we looked at A7G as like a tree. And so like the core of the tree is like literally in the middle is like A7G, like those youth that are always going to Friday nights and going to things. They're like right in the middle. And then they're surrounded by, their family and friends and the greater community and so on. And then they build this beautiful tree that keeps growing. And like the branches are like the different activities that we do or the different reports that we write or different events that we do and so on like that. So anyways, like I could talk about A7G, all the things we do for like so long, but hopefully that gave you a really good image of who we are and the kind of work we do.
That's amazing. And I done my research on A7G, but to hear someone talk about it and the way you talk about it this is where the passion is. This is where people like you, your stories need to be heard. And I'm always fascinated with what youth can do, right? We always think there's just because of age, there's a lack of wisdom and experience. But I say that's a Western concept. right? Because the way I understand youth and children, they're closest to where we come from, right? In our spiritual realms. And I was always taught that that's, the place of origin. That's where everything we know, that's where our creator lives. That's where the great mystery, whatever term you use, the knowledge of our people lives there, right? And so youth come from that and they're closest to it. And when they speak up and they talk, we should listen more closely. And it's good to, and I just wanted to share that just to kind of add a little bit more onto my perspectives too, and how I envision youth as a strong advocate for change, right? We never should underestimate them. And as I was listening to your explanation of A7G, it was reminding me a lot of the Reconciliation Manifesto. I'm not sure if you've ever read Arthur Manuel's work or not. He's no longer with us. We passed away a couple of years ago now. In that book, I'm not sure if it's this one or if it's his previous book, but I know he talks to this idea of how grassroots level and grassroots organizations are the true framework and model to drive forward any type of effort to, deconstruct, decolonize anything, right? And I encourage everyone to have a look at that book. It's a very good read. You should suggest you read his first book though, but because it that deeper explanation into the BC case. But I like that book because it drives forward the idea of how we can imagine reconciliation to be. I guess I want to ask you another question, just so when we transition to our next, and I'll ask you another question when we go and ask our other on the podcast first episode. And also the same question to her too, is looking at the Bryce report or Bryce pamphlet in 1922, he writes from his work as a health researcher, chief medical officer in the Department of Indian Affairs on Indigenous children. And going back to the quote earlier that we listened to, I guess you to think about the next 100 years, right? Because he was writing it and published it in 1922 for all Canadians to hear, but no one picked up the story. People picked up the story, but no one listened. No action was taken to rectify the change. You work a lot with youth. You have a familiarity with grassroots organizations. How do you see the next 100 years from now? Like, what do you imagine 100 years from now would look like? The kind of conversations we're having, and how will you know we've done things right by what we're talking to and what we're not talking to? It's abstract, but I wanted to go there before we move into our next segment of the episode.
I think many of us, many Indigenous folks, we're always thinking of the future. A lot of us carry those teachings about, what we do now impacts the next 7 generations. And that's really also a little bit about why we have that name, Assembly of 7 Generations. It's a bit of that philosophy as well. And I think a lot of us, we're feeling like worried, we're feeling anxiety, we're feeling overwhelmed because right now, or at least, a few years ago, we didn't feel like we had enough of our cultures, of our histories, of our languages to even pass on. And so I think that was like the urgency behind A7G when we first started it, is like, okay, we got to learn all of our languages. We got to learn all the things our ancestors knew in like a year because we're scared. And a lot of young people still tell me they have that fear today. Like a lot of folks are so scared about, what we're seeing with the climate, what we're seeing with the weather patterns, with the animals, the seasons. Like, it's really, really scary. I'm really happy, though, that those young people are so aware of it. I think that's the gift that they carry that the previous generations didn't have. Thinking of each other and our impact on the land is so, so important. And so I think about the next 100 years often. I also I think about the fact that even if I was to pass on information and teachings that I have at this very moment, and I pass them on to the next generation, that generation might not even be the generation that will be able to use those teachings and that knowledge. And so you still have to pass it on to the next generation. And so like a really great example of this is like the buffalo hunts. My one of my great grandmas was a fancy rider during the buffalo hunts, and she actually used to help herd buffalo off a buffalo jump. And the thing about these buffalo hunts is that it involved hundreds of people. It wasn't just like one mighty hunter that like herded all these buffaloes off one cliff. It was a whole like community effort, and everybody had their roles, and everybody what like knew when to pick up their roles, and sometimes it was like in a mere matter of like a few days or like even hours. But you had to know your roles that were passed down to you from generations and generations. And some generations never even experienced the buffalo hunt, but they still passed on the information from generation to generation. And I think that that's how I see the next 100 years. You know, I don't know if the information I have right now about, you know, like I love working on moose hides and hides and making smoked hides. Like I love that. But I'm not sure if that information will really benefit the next generation. Maybe it'll take like 5 generations for that information to really see its full potential. But you keep passing it down, you know, kind of like how you're talking about even like when we're sharing information, right? You don't know if it'll ever come back to you, but you still share it because you know that it might not make a big difference in this lifetime, but you're still so hopeful about the future that you keep sharing it. And you know, that's where our ceremonies come into place, and our songs and our prayers. You know, they might not even help us tomorrow or a month from now, but along the line, you know, they're gonna be there for the right moment in time. So that's kind of how I see the next 100 years. Nothing too specific, but just like broad ideas and hopes.
It's a challenging question to answer, and I always like asking those questions to people because it's abstract. I can't imagine myself 100 years from now, like this world might never be the same world we're in. And I think that is the case when it comes to what you shared with the buffalo hunting, right? That knowledge was passed on because it sustained people for countless generations. It might not be used as it is today, but I think that's for the future to figure out, right? Because we been gifted that knowledge, and we, like you said earlier, go back to we continue to pass that through generations. That in itself is the nature of how we do things, how I do my business as a Haudenosaunee scholar and a person in my community. Like, this knowledge was not mine to own. How I interpret, how I use it today is how I use it. Tomorrow will be a different day, and then youth who look at it, that's their job to figure out what's left behind, right? And that's what I'm writing. I'm doing even my own scholarly work, looking to the sources of knowledge as tools that are left behind by predecessors for us to use to help us build a better future, right? That's always been about our futurity. Okay. Thank you so much, Gabby, for joining us in this segment of the podcast. We'll go into our next segment now, where we talk with our second guest.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me. Eximaga.
Okay, so we'll start off our conversation with you, Teresa, to capture your thoughts and reactions to that segment of the Bryce pamphlet from 1922.
So very interesting hearing that excerpt, because for any logical person, particularly someone who is a medical professional, that comes to the conclusion that Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce came to regarding the circumstances of the children and the conditions he witnessed firsthand and the medical consequences from the poor conditions, it would be logical for anyone to read that and to assume, well, this will in fact happen. This matter will in fact be taken care of. The children will be removed. The government will halt what they're doing, because they know the risks and they've been informed by, the founder of health associations and an expert in both Canada and US. And yet schools stayed open for close to 76 years beyond that excerpt. It's shocking, but it's not shocking. It goes to show that when anything interrupts the agenda of the government regarding money, power, land, resources, that they too will be discarded and put to the side as we Indigenous. We will be all sacrificed for that greater goal that they're trying to accomplish.
And it's ironic for you to say that. And I think I spoke to this in previous conversations with our guests on this podcast, where we talk about nation building and how residential schools were part of that story. And so I wanted to circle back to that conversation and hear your insights on it, because you have a particular perspectives from a legal standpoint. For you, how do you conjure that idea of where residential schools play a role in Canada's nation building?
For me, I envision it sort of as a wheel, and there were all these pieces that were happening concurrently to take away the sovereignty of First Nations, essentially cutting the limbs from us, whether it was, the implementation of the Indian Act, originally named La Loi des Sauvages, the law of the savages, the doctrine of discovery, where we're deemed to be subhuman and not worthy of occupying this land or being deemed of occupying this land because we were not Christian. You have the implementation of different aspects of the Indian Act, which contained laws about trespass, not allowing anyone to come onto our reserve or allowing us to go, requiring a pass, cutting off economic development and economic sustainability. And then when all of those things were not working, they looked to other countries and what was the last straw in colonization to defeat a nation or nations, and that was to attack the family, right? Because originally they started with day schools, and those were deemed immediately ineffective. They knew they had to remove the children from the home so they could not only disrupt, I don't ever use the word legacy of residential schools, because if you look it up, there's a lot of positive connotations. That's why we always use the negative impacts, the PTSD, the traumatic effects from residential day schools, child welfare. They were all pieces to remove power, that we were not allowed to vote, whereas traditionally women were matriarchs, had, clan mothers had access to power and voting and informing chiefs to be the echo maker and go meet with other chiefs of other nations to share that information. And with the imposition of the Indian Act and governance structures, it removed that entire structure. So for us, when I say us, I mean Indigenous women in particular too, we came down and lost power with the imposition of the Canadian structures and voting systems and everything, because it was far less power than we ever had within our own nations. And that took away sovereignty, it took away all traditional roles, feasts, everything made illegal, ceremony, anything that would strengthen and maintain our way of living, our access to medicines, our use of medicines and ceremonies, all of that being made illegal. So it was all part of a scheme, all pieces of pie of a wheel to destroy us. And that's how resilient and amazing we are, is that they still didn't get us. They harmed many and they killed many, and many died. However, we are still here and we are building stronger and stronger. And almost every second Indigenous person I talk to is gaining language revitalization and returning to culture, teachings, family, whether it be within their own nation or within a neighboring nation that they're residing in. So that's a long answer for what you got, but that was a big question. That was a big question to try and say. So this is the final piece, is to get to the heart of the family by removing their children. What better way to totally destroy a people than to disrupt their family, and not only disrupt, but harm so greatly their family for generations in the way that was done to us.
Well, that's exactly it. And I asked the big questions, and that's why I like having these conversations with people, and to help our listeners think more broadly in terms of residential schools, not just simply as the sole example of colonialism in Canada. And I do this with my students at Brock when I talk to them about the history in Canada. There were many things happening simultaneously, as you talked about, this wheel and these compartments and how everything fits together neatly. But we always look at the one aspect and say, this is the pinnacle of colonialism, which it is. But there are the dispossession aspects that take place and, like you said, target the family. It's done with intentions. And I like how you referenced looking elsewhere. And you see that with the Flood Davin report that was published before. I think Sir Johnny brought up the law that stripped children from their family because it was based off the Carlisle Indian Residential School or boarding school in the United States. So thank you for sharing all that information for us to help us think about it. And just before we go into our conversations about your work and what you do at the Legacy of Hope Foundation, I want to go back to this particular piece of his final lines in his pamphlet from 1922, where he's talking about justice and how he's in his position talking to what has been done to them. So he's calling for justice done to the children, but also himself. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on why that may be a significant piece to kind of think about when reading this pamphlet.
That's an excellent point, because what it points to, it's almost a warning, right? To anyone that would dare speak out against government, that would expose government, that would speak the truth. I mean, we're not talking about his side, her side, or their side, and all different sides and a version of the truth. We're talking facts. This was a medical doctor. The reason the government engaged him was because of his irrefutable, undeniable medical expertise. But when he did not come back with the responses that supported their actions, he was unfunded. They tried to bring him into disrepute. They tried to essentially cancel him back in that day for being an ally for us. That's why it's so important that we have Canadians at large to stand with us, to be allies with us. This isn't an Indigenous issue. This is a humanity issue. The only way that we will overcome is by gaining strength in our nations, yes, but also having partnerships and relationships based on respect with other Canadians who will stand with us to say who are the lawmakers, who are the policymakers, who are the police officers, who are the doctors, who are in every field that stand beside us and say this is no longer acceptable. I mean, it goes on still today. We don't have clean water in over 100 communities. This is an international human rights crisis. Our people do not have running clean water in a country as wealthy as Canada. When we had a problem in Ontario, there was a whole report. People were fined, jailed, and it was every station of the news. Yet it's somehow completely acceptable that this is the way it is, this is the way it's been, and, we can make do. We're somehow, oh, it's too expensive. Oh, we'll deal with that later. And here we are generations and generations later, where we still don't have access to clean water, which is a contributor to our everyday health and well-being. Thankfully, there's less than 40% people living on reserves in those conditions, but really, we have the right to mobility. Is that really to be in our traditional territory? That's not an option. We can't even have clean water to be there. Don't get me started. Sorry, I'm like on a tangent. Sorry. As I drink my clean water. Thank you.
No, this is what we need to have. We need to have these conversations. We are about doing things as courageous. It is really for us to enter spaces where we don't know something and bring in our knowledge And that knowledge might not always be correct, or we might not have the knowledge, but to leave that space well-informed or more informed, but also charged with, like you said, action. And for me, I think this always goes back to that same point. I like how you talked about it. It's a humanitarian problem, not just a humanitarian issue, not just an Indigenous issue in Canada. Even when you're talking about plain drinking water, and anyone listening, in fact, could even do this, like look at the major metropolitan areas that are local to you and ask yourself how many dollars did they invest in build-up of infrastructure recently. That's a stark example of a comparison to say, why is it that these millions of dollars are being invested in, and not to say you can't invest it, but it's really to draw out where funds are allocated, and obviously it's different levels of government we're talking here. But it draws out the point that there is a duality in terms of how people live in Canada, and how, like you said, right, this history has always been about letting things be the way it is because that's status quo. What we always try to do as scholars is to disrupt that narrative, and this goes back to like a hegemonic narrative that we find persistent in life. I want to go into our discussion today because as much as we're looking backwards per se, part of what we're talking to in this episode is futurity and hope, because one of the things that I find fascinating about his work is he was writing in a time when he tried to imagine a different reality or a different future for children. And like he said, he's a warning sign that he was saying this is pushed out of office because of the whistleblowers or silence. But I think he was trying in his time, I'm not a historian by training, but when I look at his work, it makes me think that's what he's trying to push for. And now it's been 100 years since this report was published as a pamphlet. I want to ask you, Teresa, like, what do you see as the next 100 years? And how will you know we've accomplished change, or is change what we need? What do you imagine the next 100 years to be like?
That's a wonderful question. And I often will say that as a challenge to people. I say to them, what do you want your future ancestors to say about what was happening in 2023? They're going to look, oh, I had a relative that lived then. Were they marching in the streets every day to protest that there wasn't clean water? Were they burning down buildings to protest the high rates of missing and murdered? Were people taking to the streets to raise awareness of the injustices of the high rates of imprisonment of our Indigenous men and women? All of these things. Our future generations are going to look back at us and say, what is it that we did to try and alter the future for the next generations? And one of the things that amazed me in my own career, I have been working since I was 16 years old to address Indigenous human rights, and close to 40 years. And I think for so many years I thought we have to get government funding, increased government funding. We need government to change policy and programs. We need government to reallocate new funds. We need to have them recognize sovereignty. We need government action, right? Now, I'm not saying that we don't also need those things, but something woke inside me when I saw, and I believe that the children made themselves known. I believe this is a time in our universe that the children made themselves known because they knew, or spirits, ancestor, creator knew that it would be at a time that people would be ready to hear it and that they would be ready to act on it. And so how this all ties together is that when in May 2021, when we started hearing about all the uncovering of the children that we've all known in our families and in organizations for decades, that people have been, missing and murdered from residential schools and all the atrocities and everything. And I had hoped for, 35, 40 years that government would do something. What I saw was mobilization from Indigenous and non-Indigenous doing the impossible. And it's continuing. Where we have people, ice cream shops that are mobilizing and distributing information. We have alcohol or weed stores that are raising awareness about this. I'm trying to give you like the breadth of, Barbie, Patel, and I'm not saying these, I'm not paid to say these. I'm just saying like huge businesses, small businesses, Indigenous businesses, non-Indigenous, community, elementary schools, high school, people from across Canada, and I would even say the US and the globe, have reached out to us, the Legacy of Hope Foundation, and offered, what can we do? Tell us, not just money, like what can we do to spread information, to invoke action? How can we do it? And we created a document called The Raven as Messenger in collaboration with another organization, and we gave specific actual, steps and actions, concrete steps and actions that any citizen could take to give them some ideas of what they could do to help make this, better relationships, more justice. Because don't forget, so many people approach this, to look at this as a way of what can we do to help Indigenous people heal from these atrocities? What can we do to support those poor natives that need to heal? And I'm being facetious, clearly, right? But they're coming at it with a general, a good heart. But what we need to actually start with before we can come at solutions of all the action that we can do to change the future is we have to recognize that 7 generations of Canadians have been brainwashed and fed this racism and injustice and inequality in the law and lack of equity and all this misinformation for generations, so that they've benefited from resources and lands, and where Indigenous people did without or were sacrificed, right? So we still have to bring them along on that journey of waking up, and it's happening. And so that's what gives me hope, is I'm not waiting on the government to save us. What I'm seeing is we are saving ourselves. And there are Canadians, and there are youth, and there are seniors from all kinds of racialized communities. There are immigrants and refugees. There are, like I said, small, medium, big, large businesses all coming forward and saying, let's do something, let's do it together, we stand with you. And that hasn't lost momentum. That's been continuing since that first came out. So for me, I do see a different future for my children. I do see a different future for my grandchildren, and so on. So, 50 years, 100 years, I do see a better future for us. And what could that mean? That could be equitable relationships. That could be strong and thriving nations. One of my favorite passions to do in very little free time that I don't have as much now that I'm a Giju grandma, but before, in my younger years, I would volunteer with youth to teach them things like financial literacy or Indigenous history. But one of the most important things I wanted to give to them was to say who we fundamentally are as Indigenous nations. It is not these problems that you see in the last 150 years of poverty, addiction, suicide, all the indeterminates of health, all of that. Who we were, for our ancestors say time immemorial, but scientists will concede for more than 15,000 years, minimally, we were thriving nations with strong languages, with methods of justice systems, with methods of trading and economic development systems, governance systems, ways of battling, trade, every aspect of a society. We weren't just walking around willy-nilly, just walking around aimlessly. We were strong and thriving nations. And if there's any gift that I could give to future generations, is to have pride in who we fundamentally are. We are strong Indigenous nations who are creative. We are unimaginably talented and wise and hold so much knowledge, so many generations. I mean, pharmaceuticals are replicating or trying to replicate all traditional medicines because we have that knowledge and those medicines and those abilities. So I know, again, I went full circle with that whole answer, but I see hope. I see a total transformational new world for future generations. And if I can play any little part in that, in the life that I lead and have modeled for my children, and I like to think I have a daughter that works at Assembly of First Nations doing what I was doing 30 years later. And there have been great advances that have been made since that time. And I see my grandchildren who I've been blessed to be able to teach them language and ceremony since they've been born. And I just see such an overwhelming return to that. So I'm filled with hope and confidence that we will know a better future for the other generations to follow.
Thank you for sharing that. And I've asked that question to our previous person who spoke to you, and it isn't an easy question to answer because we all don't have foresight ability, but it's not to say we can imagine a different tomorrow. To me, that's always important, the work I do, because I always ask that same question: how do I impact tomorrow by what I do today? And I was teaching this to some children before at school, and one of the children was talking like, sounds like quantum science. And I said, how do you know what quantum science is? And he was I think like a grade 3 or grade 4. And to me, it's like, that's ironic that question came up, because this is what our ancestors are, and they're still here with us today, right? And that to me is grounding. And I can't remember, I was watching a video by Rick Hill. I can't remember the title of it, but he was talking about how the ancestors live in the grass because, like in our philosophy, when we bury our loved ones, they go back in the earth, and they're a part of the earth, and they're around us. So creation, as much as it's hypothetically look at plants, there's actually knowledge there from the ancestors, and they're always with us. And I always think of that kind of stuff because that is what drives me forward to imagine a different future. And I do see a lot of change happening, even in my work at the university. A lot of students are coming through now with knowledge about residential schools, and I think this is attributed to changes to curriculum. It's making an impact, and I think I want to develop another one more final question to you about your work at the Legacy of Hope Foundation and how your organization is having an impact on anything to do with redressing colonialism and its historic impacts on our people. Also, like you said too, with Canadians, like, who are not just Canadians, but people in general who want to learn to do more. And so would you mind speaking to what your organization does to help that aspect of colonialism, redressing the history of colonialism?
Absolutely. Well, I hadn't shared this earlier, but I am an intergenerational survivor. My mom did attend residential schools. And I did want to mention this because I didn't get a chance to, but one of the things that I've been able to end the cycle of abuse in my life with my children have grown up and they've not experienced sexual abuse. I've been 35 years, abstaining from alcohol and drugs. I don't smoke cigarettes, and they've grown up in ceremony and around their culture and appreciation for the teachings and everything that our ancestors have taught us. So one of the ways personally that each of us could do that is by revitalizing our culture and sharing that with future generations. Now to your question now about LHF, we've been around for 23 years. Originally, there was funding set aside through the Aboriginal Healing Foundation by the government, but it was for 5 years, and then they extended it for 10, and then 2 years to wind down for the financials. But they had the forethought, and this is amazing. This is like how we could do things to set it up for success for future generations. They had the forethought to create an arm's length, not-for-profit charitable organization that would live on forever, or forever how long it would be needed to bring equity to Canada. And so we started in 2000, and our mission and mandate was to educate Canadians about our history because it's not mandatory to be taught in any school. You have provinces and territories that have adapted their curriculum, and LHF did work with the territories in NWT and then Yukon, and Nunavut has brought in their own because they brought in Indigenous people in governance. So you have an adaptation of Indigenous curriculum in the territories. And for example, there are provinces that are willing, but it's not compulsory. So we've worked extensively with Ontario. And just today, I got fantastic news. Not the government, it's the First Nation educators that will be doing curriculum for New Brunswick. So that's so exciting. So some of the things we do, we produce curriculum from kindergarten to grade 12, and we give these tools because we have a lot of Indigenous teachers or educators and non-Indigenous educators that are saying, we want to teach about this, but we're not the expert, or we don't have tools. There's not a lot of resources. Now, more and more, you're having organizations that are doing, developing tools, developing exercises, but they're often not comprehensive enough. It might be one or two, which is great and helpful, and that we need that. And then we need to tell teachers too, you weren't an expert necessarily about the Holocaust or about any other travesty that's happened or atrocities that have happened in history, but you could still teach about them, going to the right people, looking to local people and engaging them to find the right materials for your territory of the Indigenous people of that area. So we try to do that. I have staff. I was supposed to go tomorrow, but I am not well. So we're going to Edmonton, and we're meeting with a treatment center that incorporates sweat lodge and all other ceremonies. And we record these as part of, we have a whole well-being initiative that's a standard for LHF. And a lot of the funds that we get for donations, because we divide them through educational resources, exhibitions, and for survivor workshops. So we either put on workshops in a community where they're filling with ash baskets. This is the last ash basket maker in this community, and they're already close to 60. So let's go in and we talk with them, engage with the community. We video a workshop of them doing it, or we put on a workshop where we fund 30 people to learn how to make a hand drum, and we record it, and we put those videos on our Indigenous Survivor portal for people that they can hold an event and they can recreate that workshop for themselves. So getting traditional knowledge in the hands of survivors at different tools that help and I say survivors, I think any Indigenous person to some degree is a survivor, because we're all survivors of colonization. We all have been impacted by Indian residential school, day school, the child welfare system, the Indian Act, or the lack of anything from the Indian Act. With the Inuit in the north, they've experienced, and not to compare anyone's trauma, but they've experienced so much of the trauma for so much longer because they were out of public oversight. And then Métis have their challenges with recognition and legal recognition, so that they'll be able to access services to meet with their nation that has been impacted by trauma. So we try and raise money to have a direct link for minimum expenses as possible. For example, we'll use 3 project funds to send our staff out west to do 3 different things to maximize the benefits for our people for minimum price. So we're very, very cognizant about not spending a lot of funds and maximizing the positive impact for the Indigenous people that we engage with. And then the other areas I had mentioned is exhibitions and curatorial projects, where we design exhibitions on different topics: day school, escaping residential school, the 60s Scoop, Winnishkatan, which is about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and LGBTQ. Plus, we have 2 of them on Peter Henderson Bryce, different versions. And I think we're looking at producing a 3rd travel version, because they're all in such high demand. We have Generations Lost. We have a specific for Inuit, We Were So Far Away. We have ones for the Métis called Forgotten. We have one specific, like I said, Generations Lost for First Nations. So we're trying all aspects and building partnerships with all the people that I mentioned before, from students, teachers, universities, colleges, small, medium, large businesses, municipal governments, provincial governments, federal governments, chief and council, communities, youth groups, churches. We work with everyone we work with the willing, to do better. and action, not just look like we're doing something, let's all do this to make it look like we care about the issue. No, we actually do actions with all those people that we've mentioned to make a direct impact. And because it's survivor driven, and we have representatives on our project advisory committees, and we do outreach to Canadians, we hear from Indigenous people what the priorities are for the next. And what's been really phenomenal with our exhibitions is that we were sort of above or ahead of the curveball, or whatever you want to say. We released Where Are the Children, our first exhibition, which was about the day in the life of a child in a school prior to the TRC. And when the TRC came out, they traveled with that. So many people thought it belonged to the TRC, but it actually belonged to the LHF. And what we did prior to that was we recorded over 600 oral testimonies that are survivor empowered testimonies that are available. And they wanted us to be the custodian, the stewards of those testimonies, to share, to educate with Canadians so they could hear firsthand what happened to them, and so that it couldn't be denied and that it would live on after they had passed. So we've done that. We've continued to do that. We have done Our Stories, Our Strengths, and then we went back and we did Our Stories, Our Strengths Continued, and we interviewed children and grandchildren from residential schools to show how the impacts. This isn't a historic issue, right? Like the last school closed in 97. People think 96, but it was actually in the north for the Inuit. And then you had day schools often run by the same administrators. And then, of course, child welfare just took over, and we have more children in care than we did in residential schools. So it's ongoing. We know that there's a need for this. And I always encourage, I'm not competing with other Indigenous organizations. I support wholeheartedly. I try and work with, we've been at events for all the national Indigenous organizations and small groups, big groups. It's never a question of, we're competing for the same funds. I always tell my team, there's more than enough work for all of us to work together collaboratively to make this change. We need all of us working from every angle, from academics, people in police, people within the judicial system, people within, hospitals, EMTs, everyone, because they all have consequences, right? We also offer training. I didn't mention that, to medical professionals. That's been something that we've been doing the last 2 years. So when they come into contact with someone, that they know and understand a little bit about Indigenous history and the fact that there's a huge mistrust for medical professionals. So that's something we also do. But to get back to how the exhibitions have been ahead of the issue. So we collected those 600 testimonies prior to the Indian residential school settlement agreements. And then we did it with 60 Scoop. And that was before the 60 Scoop settlement agreement. We did it with day school, and that was before the day school settlements. And recently, we just produced the Cruel and Unethical Medical Experimentation exhibition, which highlights much of what Bryce was talking about, and so many other atrocities that people who are still living experience with forced sterilization and torture, experimentation, sanatoriums. If people had mild vision, they were sent to a center for delayed individuals and had no education. Like the atrocities are on and on. But my point is, again, because we have the involvement of community and Indigenous people from across Canada, and I say community broadly, of First Nations, Inuit, Métis across Canada, and giving us feedback when we travel to all over Canada about what the next exhibition, what's the next issue. That's how we've been able to sort of be ahead of the game, if you not game, but ahead of the public with exposing what's been going on. So that's something that we have to watch out for. And a new one that we're working on that the government has asked us to do is about the Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And we were kind of torn with that because we've already been doing a lot always for that. And we see that as a day and an opportunity to educate kids when they go back to school and get at them at a younger age, right? From kindergarten on, because we used to educate only from 7 to 12 in our interventions about Indigenous history. And we had a boy that was 12 who said, I can't believe I didn't know about this earlier. And that made me realize, kids can, if done in the proper way, learn about this history, just as they do about the House of Anne Frank or other, like, as I mentioned, other atrocities that have happened in an age-appropriate way. And why do we do that? Because it shifts the perception of the individual learning this information and those people, and it eradicates, it gets at racism, it fosters empathy, understanding, actual facts, knowledge of what happened, and the repeated injustices over and over. Like, here you have a report by a medical official that chronologically and academically, medically recognized, known throughout North America, produced medical results that were not up for debate or demand. And you still have deniers who say that residential school was a great thing and no one will ever convince them otherwise. So I don't waste my time. I don't waste my time with those people. And what we do at LHF is we work with the willing, and we're making advances and real changes in our lives and the people around us by doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that long list of everything that goes on. And it's precisely why I also asked that question too, because that same question I always find in my work too comes up, well, what can I do next? How can I help? Where do I get resources? And those listening in our audience, I encourage you to check out the Legacy of Hope Foundation website to just broaden your perspective on one part. And also, if you're looking for guidance and future activities, there's resources out there. Thank you so much for sharing that with us and to walk through what you do. And I'm very struck by that point about, how children have power to make change. And we see that through and through people like Shannon in her dream to have a school in Lawrence, right? And how that sparked a movement. I think that's a very strong point for us to kind of conclude our conversation today, because the children matter. And this is why we do the work. This is precisely why I do this work in education, because the children are important. In our language, we say Sangiri Hawana, like they are important. And I think that's for all of us to think about as we move forward on this journey. But I want to say thank you again for speaking with us today and for our final episode of this podcast series. So thank you.
Alan, thank you. Thank you. Well, Alan, thank you so much for the opportunity. I will take every opportunity to get this through by every means. We have podcasts too at LHF, some specific to language, and then we have Indigenous Roots and Hoots, because we're doing exactly that. We're trying every measure possible, to communicate and to engage people to take positive actions with us. And I know we will do it because we have been and will continue to. So, well, Alan, thank you so much.
I would like to take this moment to express my sincerest appreciation to Gabby and Teresa for joining me in this final episode of We Need to Talk About Bryce. In listening to my conversation with today's guests, my thoughts revert back to a fundamental question I often explore with my students. How do we develop critical consciousness to speak back against hegemony in our lives? In reflecting on my conversation with Gabby, her outlook, informed by her work with youth through the Assembly of Seven Generations, showcases how modern Indigenous youth and youth-based organizations are asking new questions to finding new solutions. Let's face it, Dr. Peter H. Bryce pleaded for justice for Indigenous children in Indian residential schools, but he interestingly intertwined himself. Perhaps this was his personal atonement for the injustices that he witnessed during his tenure as Chief Medical Officer. Ironically though, my conversation with Teresa reiterated another point. Dr. Peter H. Bryce gave us concrete evidence on what was transpiring in residential schools and the solutions to implement to help save lives of Indigenous children. However, no action followed. Moreover, Teresa reminds us about why this history and the current Indigenous relationships in Canada matters. The challenges Indigenous people continue facing in Canada are a humanity issue, not an Indigenous issue. So as we move forward, please recall Canada's genesis as a country, Teresa reiterates that the previous 7 generations were fed misinformation. Therefore, education is key. Subsequently, finding the pathway to educate is within arm's reach. So take a moment and visit the Assembly of 7 Generations and Legacy of Hope Foundation's websites. Here you'll find long-awaited solutions to continue your own personal education. We offer you these next steps as my conversation with both Gabby and Teresa illustrate there is a strong willingness to enact change and take action. Remember, we're awaiting your perspectives and are eager to hear your thoughts. Take care, and thank you for listening.